Let us talk a little bit about Lehi. Lehi lived in Jerusalem, probably all his life. And there are various speculations about where exactly he lived and what his property was. But what do we know, first of all, specifically from the Book of Mormon? What exactly do we know about Lehi and his family? Well, just the basics, what it tells us is that Lehi was commanded to leave Jerusalem in the first year of Zedekiah, and that this was 600 years before the coming of Christ. Now, at this time, he was married with his wife Sariah, and he had 4 sons, Laman, Lemuel, Sam, and Nephi. Now, there are some people who say he also had daughters, but the only reference we have to this is Nephi talking about his sisters when he is fleeing from Laman and Lemuel after the death of Lehi. So he could be talking about sisters, could be talking about his sisters-in-law, his brother's wives, or even his nephew's wives. The term would have been applicable in any case there. So we don't really know if he had daughters. We know he had 4 sons, and we know that they were all at least mostly grown. I mean, he didn't have any infants, he didn't have any toddlers. Nephi, being the youngest, was likely in his mid to late teens, between 16 and 18 years old, because they all get married in the wilderness. Now, of course, we do know that other people were getting married fairly young. Josiah, he had his first son when he was 14, so he was married when he was 13. But it's unlikely that Nephi would have been that young at the time. But other than that, we don't really know definitely anything about these men. We don't know anything about the family. Now, what can we surmise? But what can we speculate? As some people speculate he had daughters. My mother, her personal favorite speculation is that the 2 sons of Ishmael were married to daughters of Lehi, and that's why Ishmael's family was brought along, is so that Lehi's daughters were going with him. But again, it's just speculation. We don't know. He was obviously a wealthy man. What did he do for a living? Again, we don't know. The speculation is that he was either a merchant or a smith of precious metals. And I've heard that it is talked about in one of the priesthood manuals from like the 50s. Haven't been able to find that myself, but I've heard it said. But here's the real question. We don't really, that's the extent of our actual knowledge. But what can we calculate? Because I said, it says he left in the first year of Zedekiah. Based on that, when was he born? What's the historical context for Lehi? What was going on in Jerusalem at the time? That's the question. That's the question. And let us consider. Lehi is old enough to have 4 sons, the youngest of which is probably in his mid to late teens. Let's put him at the youngest and say about 16. The oldest, Laman and Lemuel, probably mid-20s. We'll say they range from 16 to 25, about a 10-year range. Well, if his oldest is 25, then, and I know, as I said, the kings married very young. I don't think it was as common among the general population, though. So let us say he had his first son when he was 20 years old. That makes him 45 years old at the time of them leaving Jerusalem. He's not that old. He's not an 80-year-old man. It's even possible that he may only be 40. He may have been 15 when he had his first son, just like Josiah was 14 when he had his first son. We don't really know, but we can surmise that he was not a really old man. He was probably in his 40s. Him and Sariah were probably in their 40s when they left Jerusalem. So what does this say about when they were born? Well, let us go back 40 years. What was going on? Now, this is the first year of Zedekiah, so we've had 11 years of Jehoiakim. So 45 minus 11, 34. Who was king just before Jehoiakim? That was Josiah, the great King Josiah. And he reigned for 31 years. He would have been 50 years old at the time that Lehi left Jerusalem. So he was pretty close to the same age as Lehi. Lehi and Josiah were about the same age. Only a couple year difference there. So Lehi was born, most likely, during the latter end of Manasseh's reign. Manasseh, remember, he was the evil guy. He was credited as being the most evil king in all of Judah, but he did repent as best as he could. And the last part of his reign was a reign of righteousness. Then Ammon comes in. 2 years of Ammon. Now, it's possible Lehi was born during Ammon's reign, but it's more likely he was about 4 or 5 years old when Ammon dies and Josiah becomes king. So he was born during this very tumultuous time of Manasseh and Ammon. It was in Josiah's 18th year that we have this great Passover. The greatest Passover in history. Well, at least since the time of the Judges. How old is Lehi? He's about 23. I mean, Josiah, if it's his 18th year, then he's 26. Lehi is just a few years younger. Lehi's in his early 20s. There's a good chance that Lehi was already married. That him and Sariah were a young couple. Possibly Laman was already born. So, Lehi, was he part of this great spiritual awakening? Did he spend those first 2 decades of his life kind of in the general rebellion of the people of Jerusalem and then become converted when Josiah has this great Passover? And remember, this is also when Jeremiah is preaching. And so Lehi, he's converted in the years of Josiah. And he is one of the few that listens to Jeremiah throughout the reign of Jehoiakim. And he sees all the evil that's going on. But he remembers those last 13 years, the last decade of Josiah's reign, as one of the greatest times in history. And then he has to live through 11 years of the depravity of Jehoiakim. Remember also, he's already lived through 2 Babylonian captivities, 2 phases. Because the first phase was taken in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim. Lehi would have been 35, 36 years old at the time. Laman is probably 16, 17 years old, which means that Nephi's already born at the time of this first wave of captivity, when Daniel was taken into Babylon. It's possible that they even knew Daniel before he was taken. And then 8 years later, we have a second wave of captivity, and it is just after that that Zedekiah becomes king. And this is when Lehi goes out to preach. Look at everything that Lehi has lived through. And he is a great prophet. But he is not called to preach until this time, until after this second wave of captivity. And in the Book of Mormon, we'll read is that, he was troubled in his mind. And he was praying. Could it be that he was troubled because of the second captivity? The second wave? And remember, when Jehoiakim becomes king, Laman and Lemuel, they're probably 10, 11, maybe 12 years old at the time. They're just old enough that they're coming out of their parents' house and they're moving into the world. They're getting the influence of the world, and they have become influenced by Jehoiakim's administration, by his rule. Nephi and Sam are still very much younger. So, Nephi is 6 years old, maybe. So for for a good portion of Jehoiakim's reign, he's still primarily at home with his parents. And the influence of Jehoiakim's reign is not as strong on him and Sam. I talk about this now because we are moving into reading 1st Nephi. Yes, we just read how Zedekiah came to the throne. And now we're going to read what happens in the Book of Mormon during the first year of the reign of Zedekiah. But keep that historical context in mind. Lehi and Sariah, as well as Ishmael and his wife, they all would have lived through the religious reforms and the great awakening during Josiah's reign. But their children, especially their older children, grew up during the reign of Jehoiakim. See you in 1st Nephi.
Across the river Laman, we will travel in the southeast.